Ukraine has kind of become a afterthought. But certainly a lot has been going on, and just a few points. So we know that Mr. Zelensky, General Valery Zelensky, has given another Economist interview. I don't know, remember last year, he gave an interview saying, give me a whole army, give me all these tanks and armored carriers, blah, blah, blah. Give me a laundry list of armaments, and we'll go and we'll defeat Russia. Now he's saying that there's no breakthrough. Of course, the counteroffensive, we don't have to use that term anymore because it is over. It's gone. It's done. Now they're talking about stalemate. And I wanted to pull up Vladimir Zelensky. He was on Meet the Press, I believe it was, recently. And I think his reaction to the final question, our friend Alex Christoforou posted this on his Twitter account or X account. It's a really funny clip, but I think it gets to where things are at. And then, Brian, I want your comments on this and of course, where things are at on the battlefield. But let's listen to Zelensky respond to, what is quite, I believe, a pointed concluding question to an interview. Here we go.
Before you go, if you want to share, what keeps you going? Do you ever feel defeated?
I have a lot of power, but even feeling strong and have a lot of energy, it doesn't mean that we want to fight all our life, because the price is high, like I said, because the war takes the best of us, the best heroes, the best men, women, children. That's it. But we are not ready to give our freedom to this terrorist group. That's it. That's why we are fighting. That's it.
That's it. So a meltdown of sorts. There are many jokes we could make about that 50-second exchange, but your reaction to what this tells us about where the conflict is, and of course, where is the conflict?
So as you mentioned, the Ukrainian offensive, that is over. They announced an operational pause. That's just the closest they can politically get to admitting that it's over and that it has failed. Obviously, it failed. And you're absolutely right. General Zelensky last year was talking about this wish list of equipment, ammunition, weapons that they needed to have a successful offensive against Russia, to expel them from this territory that they were considering in the south and getting to Crimea even. But I think you remember we were talking about this even months before the offensive began, and we said that there's absolutely no way for it to succeed. You just look at the reality on the ground. There's absolutely no way for Ukraine to succeed. People kept citing the previous year's fall offensives in Kherson and Kharkov. And they said, well, look at how well they did then. But if you actually examine objectively what happened, they lost an entire army conducting those two offensives. It's a war of attrition, and they were exchanging their army and their ammunition for territory. And I said at the time that's actually bringing them one step closer to defeat, not toward victory. And then the idea of doing it again on a much larger scale in the south, that was going to be a disaster, because no matter where they ended, even if they reached Crimea, this new army that NATO transferred to them would be gone. And if you looked at what Russia was doing at the same time, they were building their forces up. They were bringing in more men. They were mobilizing more men, bringing them in. And they were expanding military industrial production, which was already enormous at the beginning of the special military operation. And I've talked for months and months, and people are probably tired of hearing me say it. The West does not have the military industrial capacity to sustain a war on this scale. The artillery ammunition, they admit they cannot make enough. They're talking about expanding production by, say, 2025 or maybe 2027. They're not sure, and they're running into a lot of problems doing this. But even when they reach that target, it's still less than what they admit Russia is producing right now. The New York Times admitted that they're making probably 2 million rounds a year, which is more than the US and European Union combined after they expand production, if they can expand production. So when you look at these things on paper and you add it up, there's absolutely no way Ukraine could ever have won this. The Western media, Western governments are admitting they don't have the ability to continue arming Ukraine. We're listening to General Zelensky now talk about how Russian air power is stronger. They have all of these mines. They have this huge advantage in terms of manpower. And Mark Sloboda said basically what he was wishing for from the West is for Russia's army. In order to win this conflict, they need Russia's army to do it, because Russia's military has all of these things Ukraine would actually need in order to win. And then he started talking about technology that does not even exist. And that's how you know it's over for them. And when The Economist had this interview with General Zelensky, but he also wrote a 9-page paper about how to win positional war. And when you read it and you think that this is the commander-in-chief of Ukraine's armed forces, you ask yourself, how did someone like this ever get into a position like that in the first place? He clearly doesn't understand what's going on. He has no idea. I mean, if you just take that paper for face value, he doesn't understand how it works, and he has no idea how to remedy the situation. But then you ask yourself, if he was competent, would he even want that job in the first place? So I'm pretty sure someone like General Zelensky, that's the best that they can get. A Banderites. You have a regime infested with Banderites, a pawn of U.S. foreign policy, and in this unsustainable, unwinnable conflict, who is going to be competent and volunteer to do that job? Nobody. So you get someone like General Zelensky, and this is the predictable outcome. Someone who didn't anticipate the use of landmines. I mean, just that alone. Not looking at the New York Times last December, their article with all of the pictures and satellite images and diagrams of Russian defenses stretching from the line of contact all the way back to Crimea. Looking at that and thinking, do we have any possible way of breaching that? The answer is no. There's no way you're going to breach that. So why did you even try? That's where we are right now, basically.
Yeah. And where is the fighting happening now? I mean, and what is the future of the fighting? Because there have been conflicting reports. One side of these reports is that the United States is looking to Zelensky to come to some kind of agreement to negotiate peace. And then there's the other side. I think the State Department came out as soon as today, November 8th, saying, actually, no, we're not looking for Ukraine to pause anything. We're still all in. So it seems like the fighting is going to continue, but where is it happening now? And what is the future of it, given that, well, it seems like the writing is on the wall. There's no breakthrough. If Ukraine is saying stalemate, it appears the situation is probably a lot worse than that.
Absolutely, it is. It's much worse. It is not a stalemate. It's a war of attrition. Russia is not interested in seizing territory. Their goal is to just grind down Ukraine's military. That is what they've been doing all this year. That's what they did for most of last year. That was the whole point of the fighting in Bakhmut, in the northeast, in the Donbas region. They were just drawing in as many Ukrainian forces, as much equipment as possible, and destroying it. And people warned, after a certain point, even the Western media was warning that you're preparing for this major offensive, supposedly in the spring, and you're sending all of these men and all of this equipment. Some of their best equipment was being sent there. Wouldn't that be better if you kept that for the offensive? But they were so committed to trying to hold Bakhmut, even though it was completely irrational to try to do so, that they fed a significant part of their military into Bakhmut. So now where's the fighting? At Avdiivka, right outside Donetsk city. This is a heavily fortified city. It's probably the most fortified city Ukraine has along the line of contact. This has been a flashpoint since 2014, basically. And Russia has been improving their positions around Avdiivka. A lot of people keep talking about a big arrow offensive by Russia. Russia could conduct a big arrow offensive, but just like happened to Ukraine, it'll be extremely costly. And I think Russia would rather continue this methodical approach that they have applied and try to spare as much men and equipment as possible. And so that seems to be what they're doing. They're improving their positions around Avdiivka. There's a coke plant. This is not Coca-Cola. It's involved in coal, different chemical byproducts of coal. They're trying to take this industrial complex. It's massive. There's a massive rail yard there. If they're able to take that, they have a commanding position over all of the roadways in and out and railways in and out of Avdiivka. They'll essentially be cutting Ukrainian forces off. And that's what it looks like they're doing. They're not going to storm this heavily fortified city. They're going to cut it off, and they'll methodically grind down everyone that's still stuck in there. They're keeping pressure all along the line of contact. The very, very meager gains that Ukraine did make during their offensive. And I mean, when they have an article about this and they show you the map and all the changed territory, you have to enlarge it. It's impossible to see with your eye where they gained territory because it was so negligible. But those negligible gains are being reversed, and Russia is improving their positions along the line of contact in the south. And they've been putting pressure on Kupiansk up in the north. And that was one of the cities that Ukraine captured during their fall offensive last year. And so even that success, that so-called success, is being reversed. And a fortified city like Avdiivka, if that goes, then I mean that is going to force them to fall back to positions that may not be as well fortified. And all while that's taking place, all of this fighting along the line of contact, Russia continues these deep strikes at military infrastructure, command and control, logistics. We don't know if they're going to start targeting the electric grid again, but they're wearing that down. Part of that infrastructure is air defense. They have been whittling down Ukrainian air defense all along, and that is having an accumulative effect. That has allowed Russian air power to operate more freely along the line of contact. And eventually it's going to allow them to act more freely beyond the line of contact. So this is a problem that Ukraine has, that its Western sponsors who put them in this position in the first place. There is absolutely no way for them to solve this. They keep talking about money. They keep talking about sending more arms, more air defense. It physically does not exist. It does not exist, and they cannot will it into existence now or in the intermediate future. It has to be derived from military-industrial production, which requires factories and human resources that would take years and years to develop. They're not even talking about doing it. So once they talk about doing it, then it'll be years from that point onward. Yes, I see people in the comment section talking about the F-16s. Yes, so they have additional so-called wonder weapons to try to throw at this problem, but it's definitely not going to solve it. And when you read General Zaluzhny's 9-page assessment, you can see that even he understands at this point that barring some sort of science fiction super weapon, there's absolutely nothing that they can do. They're just going to continue to be ground down until there's nothing left. Now, how does it end ultimately? It's hard to tell because we don't know exactly what Russia's final objective is. Do they want Odessa? Do they want Kharkov? Do they want Kiev? I don't know. They didn't tell me. But what they will almost certainly achieve is demilitarizing Ukraine. They've basically demilitarized at least certain aspects of NATO. And I think it's eventually going to create a situation where there might be a political change in Kiev. From my perspective, the best case scenario would be for Russia to transform Ukraine into a nation state similar to Belarus, where it's friendly, doesn't have to be absorbed administratively by Russia, but it's friendly, and they create the conditions where U.S. interference and political capture is no longer possible.
Well, it appears, given the situation that you just outlined, and given the larger global situation where we have Gaza literally on fire, Israel, you see Zelensky complaining a lot about how the conflict in the Middle East, how the situation regarding Israel and Palestine is overtaking the Ukraine conflict. Given the situation on the battlefield, given that larger global context, it feels like the situation is fading into the background. However, I think it's important to note that the overall objectives that NATO, the United States at the lead, have with regard to Ukraine and with regard to the region are not necessarily going to go away. They may fade into the background, but they won't go away. Just like the Middle East fade into the background, and then suddenly, with Israel conducting this, horrendous assault, the United States is pivoting all kinds of ways to try to achieve objectives, including provoke Iran and engage in a regional war for its hegemony. And I think the same is kind of true here. So I'm wondering, Brian, what are your thoughts about where that will go then? Because what are these other fronts? What are the options for the United States and NATO, given that Ukraine is not going to be the breakthrough that they hoped it would be?
It's a very good point that you bring up, Danny. The mindset, the motives that drove this proxy war to begin with, that is still there. That is all still in place. The U.S. Political leadership, the corporate financier interests that drive their foreign policy, they still are bent on hegemony, global hegemony. They're still bent on upholding this unipolar world order that they created, that's persisted for decades. They want to reassert that. And so what are they going to do? Are they just going to accept that they've lost this proxy war in Ukraine? They'll make it as painful as possible for Russia. So I don't think that there's going to be a quick and easy end to the fighting. And we have to always keep our mind open to the possibility, however irrational it may seem. Just remember how irrational this proxy war was to begin with. I've warned constantly about the potential of the U.S., its allies, or some sort of proxy creating some sort of buffer zone within Ukrainian territory. So we have to be aware of that and keep an eye on that. While the U.S. was in the middle of focusing on its Ukraine proxy war, we remember that they were trying to light all of these fires all along Russia's periphery. And they're still trying to do that. Azerbaijan, Armenia, Georgia, Kosovo, Serbia. And so we just have to keep an eye on all of that, because they're not done. And then regarding the Middle East and also here in Asia, they're going to continue pushing along these fronts, and they're getting desperate, and they're resorting to increasingly dangerous options to try to reverse the situation that they're in. So how does it end in Ukraine? It's going to be a long, painful process. Russia is going to continue this process that they have begun, that they were implementing in Syria from 2015 onward. Very patient, thinking strategically, avoiding provocations at all costs. Their ultimate revenge against the West and everything that it has done to Russia and its allies, their revenge will be ultimate victory. They're not interested in short-term, immediate retaliation. But we have to be aware that the U.S. and its allies are going to try to provoke Russia into some sort of miscalculation. And that's what we have to be on the lookout for now as things begin to irreversibly shift in Ukraine.
And then maybe lastly on Ukraine, the political future, because Zelensky has rejected elections. It seems like the United States is interested in elections. Feels like that's a natural pivot for the United States if it can wash its hands with the worst excesses of this conflict, including the corruption of the Ukrainian government that it literally created. It can do so with kind of these faux elections. You get rid of Zelensky and perhaps people around Zelensky, and you can go on with some slow rolling conflict from there on out while you regroup and try to figure out what's the next flashpoint, as you were mentioning. So what is the political future for Ukraine? We've seen Zelensky literally begging on, maybe I can even pull that up because it's actually
if you can't give us money, just give us credit. I mean,
yes,
it is.
I need to show it. It's actually really funny. It's only 10 seconds. Here we go.
If you can't give us some financial support, okay, please give us a credit, and we will give you back money.
So I mean, these are new lows, I think, for Zelensky. But I think it shows the new low in the conflict. Then what is the future for Ukraine then? Because the stability, the veneer of stability seems to have been stripped off altogether.
Yeah, it's absolute desperation, and you see it from the president of Ukraine. You see it from the commander-in-chief, General Zelensky, basically penning what it amounts to delusion. It's just delusion in written form. And when you see President Zelensky begging for money publicly like this, these are not things that you say publicly. These are things you talk about behind closed doors. When you say things publicly like this, the entire world can see how weak and desperate you are. It's only going to compound your problems. With the political future of Ukraine, the economic and military future of Ukraine is just desolation. It's just going to continue to spiral downward. I can't imagine anything the West could do to reverse this, because the West doesn't care. The United States, Washington, Brussels, London, they don't care about Ukraine. They never did. It was always just a proxy that they were going to use and then discard. That's how they've used all of their other proxies. That is exactly how they were going to use Ukraine. And now we're at the end of this process. They've used Ukraine. There's very little use they can get out of it. What are they going to do to reverse this? Unless they think by reversing it somehow they can still achieve their foreign policy objectives versus Russia, then maybe they might attempt something. But what can they do? Because they themselves have economic problems, socio-political problems that they cannot solve. How are they going to solve these much more acute problems in Ukraine? So the future is, there's no good outlook for Ukraine. Probably the only people that actually genuinely care about what happens in Ukraine is Russia, ironically. And it will be probably Russia that ends up salvaging whatever is left of Ukraine, unless, of course, the West creates some sort of buffer zone. And then what would happen with that buffer zone? I mean, just think about no future. I mean, the Ukrainian people right now have no future. And I make this point all the time when I talk about U.S. interference around the globe. They convince these opposition groups, these client regimes full of these people who never be able to achieve power on their own. They're thrust into power, and they become completely dependent on the U.S. because of that fact that they couldn't achieve power on their own. You know, that they're leading the country over a cliff. They imagine, and we remember all of the optimism that we heard out of the Ukrainian the client regime from 2014 onward. All of this optimism, Ukraine was going to be this, it was going to be that, it was going to be a hub for this and that, and a bridge and everything else. And it just ended up being a wasteland. And maybe, because we probably should talk about Asia, Taiwan, the administration in Taiwan is doing the exact same thing. They're talking about all of these opportunities that the West has to offer, even as they watch Ukraine be decimated. And it's not the first time this has happened. And so what are they thinking? Why do they think that they're the exception? And the Ukrainian administration, they thought that they were the exception. And now look at where they are. So again, there's no future for Ukraine as long as it is a U.S. proxy. If ever Russia is able to lead it out of that status, then maybe we can talk. But it will still be years and years of reconstruction.
Yeah, we know when the United States is able to assert its influence in colonies, former colonies, client states, the economies generally don't do well. The Ukrainian economy right now is in tatters. It's an absolute disaster. And the political future of Ukraine is certainly in bad hands should that outcome that you described, a buffer zone, the attempt to maybe keep Kiev afloat as the conflict essentially ends in Russia's favor in every other single area, it won't be good. And so I think that is a astute prediction. If we can make any prediction, it's that if the United States persists and continues on this path with regard to Ukraine, we mentioned how the United States doesn't care about Palestinians. It will allow Israel to do whatever it wants to the Palestinian people as long as it meets U.S. interests. The United States certainly doesn't care about Ukraine. It was more than willing to sacrifice over about 500,000 Ukrainian so-called armed forces, all in the name of a dirty war against Russia. So it's quite likely that Ukraine's future is bleak if the United States and NATO, of course, are going to continue to be allowed to get its way in that country.
Thank you for tuning in to my latest video. I appreciate all of your support. This channel, however, needs your help. I am seeking to make this channel more sustainable in the long term and upgrade necessary equipment to ensure that this work continues onward and makes progress to give you all of the geopolitical analysis that you all deserve. For that reason, I'm asking you to become a member of my Patreon community at patreon.com/DannyDhaiphong. You can find that link in the video description or in the pinned comment below. For whatever amount you choose to give, just know you are supporting independent media that you can't find anywhere else. Thank you so much, and I look forward to the next video.